Tonight's Headingley Literature Festival event in partnership with Leeds Combined Arts. Sorry for the delay. I'm sure it is a fantastic evening in front of us. Our guest speaker today is Rae Randall. Claire published last year her book Waking the Monkey, Becoming the 100th Monkey. And today she is basically talking about new information which became apparent since basically she published this book. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you very much. Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Headingley LitFest. May I thank Richard Wilcox of the LitFest and Carol Downing, who has suffered some awful injury which very nearly prevented her from being here this evening. So I have to express particular gratitude to her for basically sticking with it through the last hour or so. It's been a bit of a nightmare, not the least several hours before for her. And Leeds Combined Arts, so thank you. The title of my talk is Beyond the 100th Monkey, and some of you here tonight will already know my book, Waking the Monkey, so I shan't be going on tremendously about that, but I will be adding a little bit of historical context and backstory, most of which I've only discovered since I published the book last year, even though some of it's been in the public domain for a while. Now, those of the audience here tonight who have read the book may be surprised to hear some of what I am here to talk about. However, I would ask you to suspend judgment until the end, when hopefully there will be a bigger picture, an overview. But first, I suppose I should say a little bit about it before I build that larger view. The 100th Monkey camps of the mid to late 90s were, as their organiser, Palton Jenkins, put it, an experiment in consciousness. The intention was to seek to work with what Rupert Sheldrake, we have Rupert Sheldrake, his morphic fields, morphogenic field resonance, which he popularised the idea well, he developed the idea, the scientific idea, which had been popularised by Lyle Watson in Supernature. Some of you may remember reading that. And this was based on the work of Ken Keyes, a researcher into animal behaviour, who had noticed a new adaptive behaviour in a troop of monkeys on an island off the coast of Japan. He had observed how first this behaviour spread throughout the colony, and then unexpectedly had jumped to a troop in a nearby island. So some sort of psychic transmission was postulated, which was later formalised by Sheldrake in his morphogenetic field theory. Were arguing from his own evidence that there was a mechanism of resonance, as in when a guitar string will sound when a note of the same frequency is made. Sheldrake's work has been criticised, but his more recent Dogs That Know When Their Masters Are Coming Home work, which possibly some people may have come across, has demonstrated what many dog owners and animal lovers have known for a long time, that these animals do indeed seem to know when their masters are coming home. And so there must be some mechanism or means whereby this is effected. It has been postulated that there is a consciousness field in which we all partake and through which these acts. I would argue for a more differentiated model, since clearly some conscious beings are more connected in this way than others. I shall return to this later on. So the idea of morphic resonance was behind the idea of the 100th Monkey project, if not exactly a test of it, nonetheless an attempt to put it into practice. So the basic process we engaged in was to meditate on current world issues. There was things like Bosnia at the time, in the mid-90s, discuss all the feelings, ideas and interactions between us on in our expression of these, and seek to come to some collective group understanding or sense of the situation which had been put under the microscope. It was hoped that mutual understanding between people who might find themselves representing diverse viewpoints could be reached, and that this would send out a morphic resonance of resolution into the world, which would be of assistance. If all this sounds a bit woo-woo, we can remind ourselves that in the couple of decades or so prior to the camps, the CIA had been engaging in remote viewing research in the hope that it might have intelligence applicability. The true results of this research, I dare say, are not likely to be published for a long time, so we cannot say whether it was successful in its aim, but it is well documented that it genuinely took place. So, we can be sure of that. Somebody was taking it seriously and putting money into it. And research, at least as far back as the 70s, has been carried out by the Maharishi International Foundation, obviously set up by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The research that was done in the 1970s showed that covert meditation groups had a statistical effect on random crime statistics in high crime areas. And I actually saw a newspaper article about this when I was visiting my family in Florida in 1982, which was quite remarkable. And I always remembered it, so when I came across this later, I thought, that's a real strange little synchronicity out of the past. But our own process was not the same as transcendental meditation, in that it involved rather a lot of wearing away of rough edges, as one might say, between ourselves. But it was hoped that the end result would achieve the aim when resolution had been achieved in our own little microverse, sending out waves, perhaps like the gravity wave ripples that have recently been detected. Suffice it to say that my own process at the first camps in 1995 was far from smooth, and that's what the book is about. Can we have the next slide, please, Cal? I think we'll be on to. I'll be coming on to these shortly. Yes, but it left me with a feeling that I dealt with much limitation and negativity within myself, regardless of what the morphic resonance of the camp had on the world. So that my dealings with the world outside would be more functional and fruitful than before. And it gave me so much material to think about that I eventually wrote my book about the camp and what I considered to have been a rite of passage of sorts through which I was to pass. I've now begun working on the sequel, and I won't give too much away about that, but I will just say that my summary of it would be that in the end, the outcomes were influenced by human weakness, which I suppose is probably no big surprise. Strange synchronicities did occur along the way, which is always something that people say is kind of an indication that something's going on in some kind of psychic realm. Because and what really freaky one we had was that on the morning of the 28th of August 1995, we were meditating on the Bosnian War and the siege of Sarajevo and all that stuff that people will probably remember. We later found out that while we'd been doing that, somebody had shelled a bread queue and dozens of people had been injured or killed. I can't remember what the feeling was, but it was eventually caused such an outcry that NATO got involved and the war was brought to an end. So that's kind of not exactly the way you would imagine that a meditation camp would. Well, I'm not suggesting that it was causal, because in a Jungian sense, Carl Jung wrote a book about synchronicity, and he says it's an acausal connecting principle. So basically there's just something similar about these events. It's not suggesting anybody caused it psychically, but that in some way you're you know, perhaps you're messing around a little bit by trying to think that you can change events. So anyway, well, sorry, I just lost my place here. So anyway, it's sometimes said that the experiment failed. When people talk about an experiment, they didn't get the outcome you desired. But from the position of the scientific method, an experiment only fails if it doesn't produce a valid result. And so long as the methodology is sound, the results should be taken as they are. So now, I hope that those of my audience who have read my book will have noticed that while I work within the parameters and assumptions of the experiment in consciousness, which clearly one has to do for any experiment, nonetheless, I do not accept the whole thing uncritically and without any analysis or critique. During the course of the book, I examined the concept of channeling, the modern term for mediumship, considering psychological mechanisms behind it, and the entire concept of the camp, although I didn't go into it in great detail, also rests on these assumptions, and so is by extension subject to the same critique. It's the backstory behind this that I shall shortly be exploring. In the later stages of completion of the book, I began to get intimations that there was a much bigger picture behind all of this, of which I'd previously been blithely unaware. But my intention with the book had always been to give an account of my own stream of consciousness as I went through the various experiences during the week. So that bigger outside frame doesn't really have to come into it. So an initiate of a mystery school does not need to fully understand how the scenery of the stage has been set up. Their principal task is to negotiate the gauntlet, face their own inner demons and conflicts, and thereby achieve some greater mastery of self. Only when that has been achieved and the acolyte become a true initiate, started on the path properly, have they achieved the necessary level of consciousness required to make sense of the theatre through which they've passed, and thereby achieve a greater insight into the motivations by which they're surrounded. When I wrote Waking the Monkey, I only intended the first part of this, and it was only when it was done that I was able to realise the second. And certainly I was aware of none of this at the time of the camp, engaged as I was in my own inner struggles in dealing with the challenges that arose, both intentional and unintended. So it was that, having retraced my footsteps and both relived and reinterpreted them, I was ready to go to the next stage. New material arose and filled the gaps. So I shall draw quite a wide net, and some of these threads may seem obscure. They'll all be drawn together with a common theme by the end. So probably here where I probably should talk about the subjects I've got up here. We have the influence of Teilhard de Chardin. People may be aware of Teilhard de Chardin and his concept of the noosphere, which has been very, very influential in the latter part of the 20th century in terms of consciousness research, and it fits into the scientific model used by the transcendental meditation research and Rupert Sheldrake. The noosphere comes from the Greek noos, meaning mind, I think it is. And so we have the CIA doing remote viewing in the 70s and 80s. This is kind of psychic espionage. Then during this period, we also have the interest in consciousness and quantum theory. There's the idea about observer-dependent universe and all that. And so that's the kind of theoretical kind of backdrop to it. And also I shall be drawing in Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. I don't know if anybody here has come across that. It's Joseph Campbell was an anthropologist and philosopher who died in the late 90s, and he was very well advanced into mythology. And that is the kind of overall mythological structure that I think I would sort of fit this into. Go next slide, please, Carol. Yes, there we are. That's the a rather nice graphic I found on the net the other night for this presentation. It's a kind of cycle where it's very similar to what Luke Skywalker goes through in Star Wars, and this is, I later found out that this was the kind of passage I went through. You kind of stumble in, you find some guide, and then you stumble into adventures, and then you fall into the abyss, and you find your way out, and it's all very, you know, kind of archetypal thing. So this is the kind of background framework of my own psychological kind of journey through it. Can we have that slide now? Sorry, not to linger on that one. So now I want to take you right back. I've been talking about the CIA. The CIA has been involved in a lot of stuff, and it's also got some very deep Masonic background to it. The people who set the CIA up, Allen Dulles, President Truman, all Masons, and there's this kind of popular notion that Masons like to put out, that the world of Masonry is all just like, you know, getting to know people and helping each other in business, and I'm quite sure there is that. But also there are many sub-lodges and side lodges and everything that the Masons have, and nobody really knows where, you know, how many or where they are. So the influence of the Masons on the CIA, they go back deep into the occult movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. Probably heard of Helena Blavatsky. She was the person who brought some of these ideas which emerged in the New Age movement of the 80s and 90s. Ideas of ascended masters, channel beings from other dimensions and stuff like this. Aleister Crowley, obviously everybody's heard of Aleister Crowley. He was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and he was a member of more secret societies than he could shake a stick at. So he was, he was kind of setting up little projects, basically. This is what we're going to get into. People who like to set up projects, to set up little cults and things like this. So the next thing we come to is in the 1920s, the Theosophical Society. Now the Theosophical Society are very strange because they seem to be all kind of like the sweetness and light and wonderful and everything, but actually it's not quite as simple as that. And for instance, Alice Bailey's husband was a Mason, and so there was quite clearly a strong Masonic influence in this. And the publishing house which put out Alice Bailey's books, all this stuff that was supposed to be channeled from the Tibetan, was actually originally called the Lucifer Trust, which was fairly rapidly reduced to the Lucis Trust, which sounds much nicer. They really have quite definite ideas about the future of humanity, but we'll come to that a bit later on. And so there we have the Masonic ring. So can we have the next slide, please? What have we got here? The CIA. Oh yes, right. Yes, well, these are names that you will know a lot more about before the end of the evening. Andrea Puharich I should really probably put Gordon Wasson first. Gordon Wasson came onto the world stage in 1957 when he published an article in Life magazine. It was one of those, you know, big glossy 1950s magazines about magic mushrooms from Mexico. And obviously no one had heard of this before. It was just a little private little thing that the Mexican people did. It kind of burst onto the scene, and the beat culture picked it up, and they were all going down there. And Gordon Wasson was supposedly a respectable anthropologist, and he completely screwed up this Mixtec village in the Yucatan Peninsula, I think it was, or thereabouts. And he was completely irresponsible about it, and he later on said, oh, well, I'm terribly sorry and everything, but actually what happened was that the village where he went and studied this stuff got completely destroyed, because so many beats went Jack Kerouac type people. Then he went and brought it back to California. He's not happy with messing up with the local culture in Mexico, and he gets his mate Gregory Bateson, who they all have CIA connections, these people. Now we're getting deeply into the CIA. Andrea Huharich is employed off and on by the CIA, and he eventually sets up the channeling group, which creates the Nine, which creates the Only Planet of Choice, which was the idea where the 100th Monkey came from. And Gordon Wasson and Gregory Bateson and Andrea Huharich, they were all friends of Aldous Huxley as well, who was keen on, you probably have heard of his book, The Doors of Perception, but also Brave New World, which came out 20 years before or something. Now obviously they didn't know really what was going to happen by doing this, but they were definitely promoting it. Now at the same time, Huharich was getting involved with channeling, people channeling extraterrestrial beings. I think we're probably not time for the next slide.
Yeah.
Oh yes, well here we have that. This is Wasson, and this is Albert Hoffman. I came across this picture. Albert Hoffman, the chap who invented LSD. So it's very kind of interesting because these people, they're not kind of, they're not, I will come across Ken Kesey later on, but these are not Ken Kesey. These are dignified, older people, And anyway, can we go on to the next one, Karen?
Yeah.
Speed up a bit, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So also, anyway, Huharich became an expert hypnotist. He was also designed covert hearing aids and tooth radios. So when he set up channeling and mediumship groups that were aimed at trying to get these extraterrestrials, his methodology was very, very poor. He was always suggesting things to people. And my own personal belief is that what he got out of these mediums is a mixture of stuff from the collective unconscious and his own suggestion, although there may be other things there, it's hard to say. But Uri Geller got involved with this and apparently channeled an extraterrestrial intelligent conscious computer called Spectra. And it all got a bit much even for Uri Geller, and he dropped out, and Huharich was very disappointed because he really thought he had struck gold. But Uri Geller also has had long-term involvements with Mossad. So you see, all this stuff is very deeply embedded with the intelligence communities. Then I came across the book by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince on the Stargate conspiracy, which told me a lot of this stuff about Huharich and how he had kind of seemed to have been putting together a lot of this cult creation. which you'll kind of see what I mean by that when we go on. The neurophone, it's just a brief little thing there. A neurophone is a device whereby sounds can be beamed into people's heads by the use of modulation and microwaves, so that without, it being audible to other people. And that was invented in the 1960s with the CIA sequestered the patent, and it's kind of barely got out even now, really. Oh, next slide, Carol. Right, the next one. There we go. Oh yeah, that's just the book. That's the book, The Stargate Conspiracy. Excellent read. You can get second-hand copies on Amazon quite cheaply, I think. We'll get the next one. Oh, well, I'm going to have to. Have you got your class by Carol?
Sorry?
Oh, you've got the class. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll keep going, hopefully. Right, yes, and so this is where a very large amount of 60s psychedelic culture came from. You might know these names, Ken Kesey. You probably might not know Robert Hunter, but Robert Hunter was a friend of Ken Kesey, and in recent times, he's actually written albums with Bob Dylan, and he was also the long-time songwriter for the Grateful Dead. Ken Kesey and Robert Hunter got involved as volunteers. They were GIs, conscripts in 1959, 1960, and they volunteered for the Marion County Veteran Hospital trials in LSD. And it was all legal at the time. This was an extension of Wasson and Bateson, and they decided to move up their culture from messing up villages in Mexico and move it up to San Francisco, which was a kind of wild enough place where something like this. So this was actually part of what many of you might have heard of MK Ultra, mind control experiments that were taking place in the 50s, 60s, carried out on a lot of GIs, military volunteers, psychiatric patients. And Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he was actually the janitor of the house. He wasn't actually, I don't think he was actually a volunteer subject, but stories abound about how they left the fridge open, and it was kind of, they were almost like asking for the stuff to walk. And so Ken Kesey, told his mates about it, and Robert Hunter, he was actually an experimental volunteer, and so it kind of spread out, and you would expect it to, because this is San Francisco, it's all kind of wild, this stuff is where people have been hearing about it, but it's all kind of, it's actually, I think deliberately, that I think Bateson and Wasson were deliberately kind of creating a kind of wild culture that encouraged it to spread in the way that it did. So what you had in San Francisco was the what I would call the wild culture, where the bands like the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead came from, because it was it wasn't controlled at all. But then later on, the model was picked up, and the second generation of 60s bands picked up all the Laurel Canyon bands, like Mums and the Punch, Doors and John Mayall, and about 7 or 8 or 9 major bands all happened to live in Laurel Canyon, and it just happened that they all had fathers who worked in the military intelligence. And Jim Morrison's father, for instance, who was an admiral in the Navy, for the Vietnam War. So this might seem to be drifting. I've got to keep it moving, but the point is, this is the culture that has been created by these people, Wasson, Bateson, Aldous Huxley. They've actually been deliberately pushing things, so that when in 1972 the Stanford Research Institute Social Policy Unit was asked to research these changes that had happened in the 60s, they didn't come back and say, well, some of it was good, some of it was not so good. Like civil rights is one thing, but people getting killed at universities in riots is not. But they actually decided that it was like you couldn't stop it, so let's push it even more. And then we see after this, In fact, I only just came across the, coming on the next slide after this, I'll be mentioning Marilyn Ferguson. Has anybody heard of the Aquarian conspiracy? Yeah? It was big in the 80s, and she was a protege of the people from the Stanford Research Institute. So she was basically putting their stuff into practice with the Aquarian conspiracy, which is a really, really major part of this whole kind of development, because that's where we get the introduction of kind of astonishingly kind of reverse kind of ideologies. I'll come on to that in a minute though. But anyway, so really what we'll next be seeing is the engineered religions like they have in Dune. Carlos Castaneda is actually an elaborate hoax. This was part of the whole, it wasn't necessarily a deliberate attempt by the people who are masterminding it, but it's an example of something that somebody basically made up. And A Course in Miracles, people may have heard of The Course in Miracles. The partner, or the work partner of the woman who wrote The Course in Miracles, which claims to be information from Jesus Christ, no less, even though she had never been any form of Christian, and her work partner who assisted this, Bill Thetford, he was also CIA. So we're going to get a picture where all these kind of, you got the CIA, probably the Masons behind, are all kind of pushing this whole, this transcendental model. Can we connect to the next camera? And what have we got? Next one working? Well, unfortunately, we won't be able to have the video of Andrea Pilharish. Oh dear. Can you maybe go back to the...
Have to
reinitialize the...
there we go.
Oh, brilliant, yes. Oh, yes, if you just want to go, that's the picture. I used to have that book, the first edition of the Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda. Oh, we'll keep firing on anyway.
Yeah.
I've got so much to get through. Right, so can you get on to that next?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there we go. Oh, and I wish I had time to tell you about it. If you ever get a chance to read a book called The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohen, the subtitle is brilliant, Revolutionary Millenarians and Mystical Anarchists in the Middle Ages. I loved that when I was reading that in the upper sixth. And eschatology. Eschatology is the science of the end of time, or the study of the end of time. And why I put this next to the Aquarian conspiracy is that I kind of think that these people might have actually been referring back to Norman Cohen's book, which was written and published in 1959, because what he talks about is the mass movements, the mass psychological movements that swept across Europe in the Middle Ages, where people thinking that the second coming of Christ was going to happen, and that the Black Death was the end of the world, and all these mass kind of belief systems that raged across Europe, the flagellants who would whip themselves to death and things. And so it's my contention that these people, seeing that the millennium is coming up a few decades away, are using their knowledge of modern psychology, application of suggestion, psychedelic drugs to create subcultures and so on and so forth, to create an end of the millennium kind of culture. Then we have Jose Arguelles, or Arguelles, I think it's pronounced, as an art historian who Marilyn Ferguson speaks very highly of and quotes him, and there's always all this stuff about transcendental level of consciousness. And in the decade following, Jose Arguelles was to be the person who was most responsible for the promotion of the 2012 phenomenon. So he's promoting this Teilhard de Chardin universal consciousness event that was supposed to happen in 2012. And some people, debate even whether the actual Mayan calendar is correct. I mean, I think it probably is, but, just like art calendar, you know, as a day when it all comes back to zeros and we all start again, and that's not, you know. So maybe. Anyway, this is the cover of the copy of The Pursuit of the Millennium I had in the sixth form. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a bit bigger one, but it's kind of shows, you know, mass crowds of you know, poor people and soldiers and everything, and they're all, you know, waiting for the second coming and everything. So we move on then. Next one. Oh, that's the book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, that basically kind of gives away what they are going for, because there we go. That's fine. Yes. Oh, there we are. You see, they're looking for the transcendent consciousness model proposed by Teilhard de Chardin, and it's amazing, really, because we're probably aware that, and this is kind of coming on the edge of consciousness. I'm coming out from writing all this obscure stuff in the past, right to the cutting edge kind of, you know, thing at the moment. The world without borders proposed, a model proposed, and that the other is no threat. This is what I, you know, hear my people I know in the No Borders movement saying, you know, this was being promoted in 1980, and the book that Marilyn Ferguson is, it's a fantastic mix of brilliant kind of cutting-edge psychology, as it was at the time, and complete over-optimistic fantasy, saying nature has no boundaries, not like cell walls or skin or the ionosphere that protects us from cosmic radiation. No, these things are all just fantasy. So they're projecting this transcendent model of unified consciousness out on the world, which is kind of, you know, something we might get to more gradually, you know, in many generations. But so that's why I say here, modern political movements having their roots in the aftermath of the psychedelic revolution, where you know, they were saying everything is one, you know, and that it's all right when you're all loved up for a few hours at a festival, but then you've got to go home, you know. So anyway, let's carry on. I think. Let's see, right. Yes, so I rushed through a lot of this because I basically had far too much information, but I wanted to try and get it in. So the only planet of choice, which is the book which was compiled from the channelings of this woman Phyllis Schlemmer, who was the medium who Andrea Puharic eventually managed to get to produce tons and tons of this stuff from this extraterrestrial entity, which claims to be the Ennead of ancient Egypt, 9 principles of existence. And apparently they've managed to kind of produce strange bits of information that nobody would have known about mathematical formulae and stuff. But it's no proof that they are necessarily what they say they are. You know, I think it's probably some kind of mixture of unconscious material, but also there is the possibility. Now I'm only kind of, you know, leaving this open because you have the possibility that it's all a hoax, it's self-delusions, they're not quite the same things, or one people are leading other people on, or being very suggestive about that, and then you kind of get into the thinking, well, there might be something behind this, but even when there is something behind it, you don't know quite what it is. It's a bit like the Wizard of Oz, who is behind the curtain, you know. And I would suggest that if there is anything behind the curtain, other than people's unconscious, you know, kind of motivations and stuff, that you know, it's as likely to be something out of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos than it is to be, you know, some divine being who wishes us all well. We don't know, do we? So it's very interesting, really, for me to have discovered all this stuff as the world behind the belief system which produced the concepts of the only planet of choice, out of which the 100th Monkey camp came, and I didn't know any of this stuff. So it's as if I kind of got involved in, you know, like Scientology or a cult or something like that, which then I kind of went through all these really weird, kind of heavy experiences, but at the end felt that whatever the reality of all that stuff, I had sort of managed to survive and you know, kind of gain confidence and self-esteem through sort of surviving this roller coaster that triggered all these emotions in me and everything. And it's quite likely that the people who were, you know, organising the camp didn't even realise that they themselves were like second or third generations of these these kind of seeded religions that like Frank Herbert talks about in June. So I'll just read my final. So what I think was the problem with these groups is that, and you can kind of see that there's a kind of thing behind it, because there's a little bit too much insistence on agreement. So everybody has to agree on something, then you know you're into a cult, don't you? So I would suggest that this desire to create a world of absolute agreement is the creation of social engineers and Masonic manipulators like Aldous Huxley's kind of, you know, Brave New World, who wish to see a world that is easily manipulated into conformity. In the ancient world, the hero struggled against primal forces and monstrous demons. In today's world, we are faced with their apparent opposites: bland conformity and fear of being different. So in these circumstances, the hero must speak their truth and be their unique self. We should see attempts at the creation of religions, if such was the intention somewhere back up the track, as more than mere snares set by those who would seek to control us, but as obstacle courses which we may traverse and thereby gain a greater sense of empowerment by overcoming. Thank you. Cartoon version of the hero's journey. Okay, well, we'll probably need to
thank you very much, Claire, for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
And I think we have now maybe 15 minutes break. Is that all right, everybody? Yeah?
Yes, I'm not sure. I don't think we were able to arrange tea as well, unfortunately. With some
well,
biscuits.
Unfortunately, we have some water and biscuits today. But if people would like to go to the cafe and get something there, we couldn't unfortunately organise anything today. That's all right.
Yes, please support Heart Cafe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What happens after the break? Is that
Oh, sorry, I should say, yes. Well, we will take, I will of course take questions after the break.
Yes, of course, afterwards.
Yes, after the break, yes, of course. Yes. But no science after the break. Big round of applause for Carol.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate it, honestly. It was touch and go whether we're going to have a slideshow, and if I hadn't had the slideshow, yeah, it was touch and go if we were going to have a slideshow, and if I hadn't had the slideshow, I would have not got through it all, because, you know, I had to kind of depart from there's just basically had too much material. But anyway, so, I've had an interesting conversation with Richard in the intermission, but I was wondering if anybody else would like to ask any questions or anything that came up, or obviously I had little conversations with people if they'd like to, yeah.
Was the Carlos Castaneda thing just a hoax then? He was a made-up figure?
Well,
I saw a documentary on him.
Yes.
That's probably about all I know.
Right. Well, I'm very glad you asked that, because obviously I had to skate over it. He's just kind of one example amongst this plethora of different things that came out in the late 60s and early 70s.
He was peyote, that wasn't magic mushrooms, was
No, that's different.
I think we were
Yes,
the two of them.
I'm sorry, I just tried to squeeze too much in. It's just that I needed to refer to so many different things. Yeah, I'll say a little bit about Carlos Castaneda, and I'll be very happy to do so. Right, well, Carlos Castaneda was an anthropology student, and he, in the early 60s, he became interested in the work that Wasson had been doing, because Wasson was an anthropologist. I mean, if you go out looking at Gordon Wasson on the internet, there's just like, he's even connected with, he's supposed to be connected with the Kennedy assassination. I mean, that's how many things and weird stuff he's been involved in. So, in the early 60s, or around 1960, Carlos Castaneda was looking for some research work to further his, you know, anthropology studies. As I'm not quite sure, it's probably just a recent graduate, and he was looking for graduate work or something. And so he became interested in this stuff. Now, he did study a lot of stuff about Yaqui Indians, and there's a lot of stuff there where he did genuinely research this. However, after several of his books had come out, there was a very, I loved this, back in 1979, I read this book by a guy called Richard DeMille, and he had gone through, he was an expert in textual analysis, and he'd gone through and he'd compared all the different books, and he'd discovered that there were contradictions, because constantly Carlos Castaneda sort of tells the original story, he goes to Mexico, this happens, blah, blah, blah. Then, in the later books, he goes back and fills in gaps, supposedly. This happened, oh, I didn't realise that, I didn't tell you that because, and all that kind of stuff. Well, actually, Richard DeMille went and compared all the dates, because it's supposedly an anthropological study, it's supposedly a proper scientific paper, it's all documented and blah, blah, blah. And he found there were contradictions in the dates, where he was, on one book he was in Mexico, the other book he was back in UCLA, and he then went and studied the library acquisition slips in the stacks at UCLA Library, and Carlos Castaneda was, at the time of some of these writings when he was supposed to be in Mexico, actually in the stacks at UCLA Library, and he had out books on the subjects which he was writing about, which he had supposedly been there in Mexico talking to Don Juan, doing this stuff. He was actually reading books about it in the UCLA stacks. And that is a fact. So, but Richard DeMille was very generous, and he said that this is, nonetheless, it is a valuable attempt at the construction of a mythology, which I think is, you know, very, very generous of him to say that, because obviously people have got into Carlos Castaneda, and it's been a kind of big industry almost, hasn't it? You know, I don't know what Carlos Castaneda himself, I think, was a bit shy about making comment about this stuff, and the kind of, you know, debate has raged, and people deny it, and they say, no, no, it's all real.
This Don Juan stuff, it's information he's got under the influence.
Well, I imagine some of it is, and some of it he's got from genuine books about, you know, Mexican stuff that he was reading in stacks at the UCLA library, and some of it he's probably made up himself. So it's a kind of synthesis of several different things. And I think that as long as you realise that it's a kind of fantasy journey into a constructed reality. I mean, he calls it, one of his books is called A Separate Reality, isn't it? You know, it's kind of almost like giving it away. But I think that, you know, it's a kind of, as long as it's recognised as a kind of quasi-fantasy philosophy, there's some very interesting things in there that I probably, you know, haven't got time to talk about now, but I think there are some very interesting bits of philosophy. Well, just you know, pick one major thing, is that he says that the universe is kind of, there's a predatory element out there in the universe. It's a very, very important part in Castaneda's philosophy. And they're actually saying this, which is in complete contradiction to all the Marilyn Ferguson, there is no boundaries, everything is one, you know. Well, actually, I think that, you know, if Carlos Castaneda had been completely controlled by Wasson and Huxley and all those kind of people, he probably would have been singing from the same song sheet, but he's saying, well, no. So he's giving his own version. Well, I think as long as someone's giving their own version, you can trust it a lot more than if you're following what somebody else has kind of suggested that they should say, or whatever, because he's not getting this from any disembodied spirit, you know, like all these other people, all the way back to Madame Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, you know, and there are, you know, good reason to believe that Aleister Crowley himself might really genuinely have contacted some other beings or whatever, but you just don't know what their motivations are. Whereas if you know this is Carlos Castaneda's work, it's his ideas, and it might be a fantasy, it might be a construction, but it's his. So I think that what he's saying about the universe, there is a predatory element out there. I think that's something that you can say, well, that's his genuine assessment of the situation after having probably taken quite a lot of peyote, you know. So, you just have to make up your mind, you know, when you take all these different versions, because there's so much. I didn't mention, one book I didn't mention was Ken Carey's Starseed Prophecies. I don't think it was Starseed Prophecies by Ken Carey. I've searched and searched to see if I can find any material on that, about that being seeded like the Nine and the Early Planet of Choice. And I haven't been able to find anything, but it's so congruent with all that world that I'm inclined to think that it might be in there somewhere. Because Ken Carey himself is all like, there is going to be one wonderful moment where all consciousness will be one, and this will be on, actually, 21st of December 2011, he said, because he wrote this back in 1978, and I think the kind of Jose Arguelez Mayan calendar thing hadn't quite kind of formalised onto 2012 at that stage, because, you know, back in the 70s, it was just like, so, you know, he said, there was, you know, the gods will return and all this kind of stuff. So it's very, very much like exactly what the CIA has been seeding with all these groups, like the Puharic channeling groups of the Nine, you know. And of course, you have, you know, in the late 90s, there were all sorts of kind of cults of this nature, far more. I mean, the Hundredth Monkey one that I went to was quite mild, really, you know, compared to, you know, Heaven's Gate and mass suicides and things like that. I mean, we never got anywhere near like that, you know. But I think the thing is that the intelligence people who they just want to experiment. You know, that's what it is. They just want to set these things up to see what happens. It's just like, you know, the world is our psychology laboratory. So I think that's the way that it is. And then, you know, if you can get people to be suggestible, to see how far you can suggest them into, you know, maybe they'll be controllable. Oh, that's good. Oh, you know, oh, that was a bit, oh dear, oh, gosh, no. Well, maybe we're not, you know, destroyed that village, you know, entire cult commits suicide, well, you know. But that's, these people, they have a different view of reality from the street, you know, who they are, you know, like the people in Dune, the Missionaria Protectiva, they create religions, they create belief systems, you know. It's incredible. So, well, thank you very much. Sorry I went on about that. Anybody else? Sorry, yes, you.
Oh, well, I've got a couple of things, mate.
Yes.
One's a question, one's a statement. The Rupert Sheldrake thing on the animals welcoming their
yes.
Pets, or being welcomed by their pets.
Yes.
That other psychologists try to replicate that.
Right.
And they film the behaviour of the pet the whole day.
Okay.
And when they film the behaviour of the pet the whole day, the same behaviours happened a lot of times
really?
during the day.
Right.
So it wasn't possible to say these behaviours were only associated with the return of the mistress
right.
So it was like debunking that particular aspect.
Okay. So at what level do you think it was being debunked? Was it, I mean, was it a serious...
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Serious. I mean, I can probably get you... I mean, I don't have it at hand.
No.
I might be able to get you who did it. I mean, you know, it was done by psychologists.
Yes.
Or academic type psychologists, if you like. So yeah, so that was done quite a long time ago.
Oh.
And then I was just, because I have a friend who's quite into Course of Miracles.
Okay, right. Well,
so I wanted you to expand a bit on that.
Right, gladly. Well, thank you for the Rupert Sheldrake thing. I mean, I'm always into finding out scientific material.
If I can give you the the source.
Yeah, no worries at all. No. I mean, I think there probably are methodological concerns. I mean, I'm still inclined to think there is some evidence for psi phenomenon, but that it's notoriously difficult to pin it down because of the observer effect. So much is involved with it.
Well, I think the reason why it lives so potently in all our imaginations and in our senses is that most of us have had some sort of experience that seems to be the only answer to it. Yeah. And if we've not had it ourselves, somebody close to us have.
Sure.
And that's why it lives so potently. But it is quite difficult.
Yes, but I mean, I think that's one area. But the other one, Helen Schuckman and A Course in Miracles. Right. Well, Course in Miracles was. I think it was supposedly channeled in the late 60s and early 70s, so again it was all congruent time, place with all the rest of this stuff. And a lot of it is quite contradictory. It says, this is Jesus Christ. Absolutely no doubt about it. It contradicts or bears no relation to what are the, kind of standard accepted teachings or doctrines associated with Jesus. It seems to be, anyway, I'll skate over the actual content, just get to what I think is the punchline, which is that she spent the last 2 years of her life, which were quite some years later, I mean it was like 20 more years or something, that she was promoting this. The book turned into a phenomenon, millions of copies sold, institutes set up, organisations, blah blah blah. And she spent the last 2 years of her life in a state of, it's described as psychotic depression. I don't know if you were aware of that?
No.
And so I would just say, well, that, I can't imagine if this, whatever it was that was speaking through her was really Jesus, that she would have been left abandoned as an empty shell, suffering from psychotic depression, swearing about that bloody book and it's destroyed my life and things like that. It's kind of completely contradiction to what she put, whatever it is, 20 years of her life into doing. So, I don't know what it was, but I don't think it was Jesus. I would say, because it just, it seems to contradict. I did, a few weeks ago, I did look at it, but it was never a big part of my reality. When I was going to the Hundredth Monkey camps, I did read things like the Celestine Prophecy, which is admitted fiction, and it's just kind of inspirational stuff. It's quite kind of, mild, really.
A lot of what the Course in Miracles, from what I hear, is quite heavily kind of meditations each day. So that sounds different to what you're saying, and although, yes, it's supposed to be channeled, but the meditations would not be too dissimilar, I wouldn't have thought, for some Christian teachings. Not that I'm Christian.
Well,
but I haven't gone into it enough to know, so I'm just, but the fact, yeah.
But I've studied quite a lot of this sort of mysticism and stuff, and really what seems to have happened in the Course of Miracles, not read the book but I read the extract and the rest of it, is what you've got there is what I call the Gnostic Christ, who can change and alter his shape from a baby to an old person or an angel of light and all the rest of it. And there's one big problem with the Gnostic Christ, who's actually wrote a poem called the Gnostic Christ. Of course, it was still on the internet. Is that there's one big problem with the Gnostic Christ, is it bears no relation at all, or hardly at all, except for some of the moral standards, to the Jewish Jesus revealed in the New Testament.
Right.
There's a complete, well, except in some of the moral teachings, I'll be nice, be positive, and some of the rest. Except in some of the moral teaching, there is a complete difference between the two. And in the end, I had to say to someone, right, choose which Jesus you follow.
Well, I'm just, it's a while,
it's a deep area.
Yeah, it was. Like I said, it was never a part. I knew one or two people who were into it, and they'd say, "Oh, I'm doing this," and "Oh, that's interesting." And I never really engaged with it much, so it's not something that I kind of had to. That's not something that I kind of knew about because it's from experience. So I have, looked up a little bit about it recently because I realised that it was following in the thread of all this. It was all coming as part of the whole kind of what they would call the Panoplia Propheticus in June. In other words, the full armoury of religious indoctrination. I think that there are some of the problems, yes, what's been coming back to me now about the Course in Miracles is apparently there's a big debate because of the fact that it claims that evil does not exist. I think that's correct. And that is kind of just such a major challenging kind of concept to crumbs, not just Christianity, but kind of, pretty well any worldview that has involvement with any form of spirituality or or whatever, just to say that evil does not exist. It's kind of like everything melts, doesn't it? It's like, oh, you're standing on something, there's no ground. What? It's like and I think that, well, obviously this indoctrination thing about trying to persuade people to drop all their boundaries. Boundaries don't exist, they're in your mind, So evil does not exist. Well, I think it's creating a world of people who are very compliant and just will believe anything. That's my view on it. I mean, obviously people have different views. But I think it's compliance, that's what they're seeking. I mean, I think that people can genuinely have profound experiences on mescaline, peyote, LSD, all these things, but that's not really what this whole thing is about. What it's about is using the potential of these agents to mould and manipulate and make people's minds whatever you want them to be, so that they're kind of like, the people in Brave New World, So rather than using them, rather than, there's a big thing for ayahuasca in South America, and this is the vine of souls, and I dare say people go there and they have this, ayahuasca DMT experience, and I dare say it can lead to profound insights, but you're as likely to run into some kind of shaman running the workshop who'll kind of mess with your head, and having had a little bit of experience in that world, I can tell you that if people trying to mess with your head when you're spaced out on one of these agents, it's not something that's nice, and so it's just very deep water people are getting into with all these things, and they just don't realise, and that's what. Well, sorry, I wandered off a little bit from Helen Schuckman, but
no, I mean, but we're getting into deep water with quite a lot of things.
Sure, yeah.
Somewhat more modernly developed
than
that era.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I see happening with potentially conformity and our use of smartphones and the addiction to them that's being very much encouraged.
Yes.
And what is that addiction about?
Well, that you could say in a way that this is the modern
equivalent.
The modern psychedelia, isn't it? I suppose,
In many ways, one might.
Interesting.
So, and where does that lead? Because they want you to have all your life, like some science fiction smartphone.
Absolutely. That's right.
Front of it.
Yes, probably the opposite.
Just go in the other direction.
Yeah.
And in terms of acoustic, because there's a Professor Tim Layton's recently done a paper on ultrasound in the air and the health effects.
Oh, yes.
And in that appendix, he talks about long-range acoustic devices.
Mm-hmm.
He also talks about ultrasonic weapons, which are using frequencies to affect how people behave anyway.
Yes.
So that is very much still very current. It might be a little more open.
Oh,
Or people might be making more public comments about that than they were at that earlier time.
Yes. Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, the neurophone, which is the modulated microwaves that can, stimulate people's auditory cortexes so that they hear things. I mean, this has been around for over 50 years, and it's only just breaking into the like, oh wow, this is really cutting edge technology. No.
We can bring back hearing.
Well.
So it's,
So,
because we only had that film, Lawrence Harvey, I can't remember what it was called. Do you remember?
Where was that?
When his mind was being controlled from outside. It was really a really early one.
I don't think I know it, no.
Oh, gosh, maybe not.
Well,
I'm of an age not to remember, so maybe it'll come back.
I just want to say,
yes.
To come to the rescue of ultrasonics, I remember seeing a program on telly that they were using ultrasonics on the head. It obviated the need for surgery. They actually managed to cure Parkinson's disease, actually.
Really? That's amazing.
With a helmet on, actually, so they're very good.
Oh, was it one of the magnetic induction thing that was finally...
I'm not sure what it was. No, I think they had probes.
Right.
And those probes were just focusing a certain frequency onto that particular part of the brain. And it's like surgery, really.
Yes.
They didn't have to open up the skull, they were able to just...
Yeah.
And I think they cured the skull of Parkinson's disease by doing that. So there must be a lot of research into it.
Oh, yes, I mean, the understanding of neurology in the last 20 years is amazing. But I'm sure, the thing is, I mean, all these things are, if they're used proper, genuine medical, scientific uses,
it's like
kind of great, but then you can also use a,
Yeah.
you can use a medical tool to, focus it on someone and turn it into a weapon to destroy their mind.
I remember like lasers, when they discovered lasers, there wasn't any use for lasers. Now there are, of course.
Yeah, cut James
So
Bond in
good
two.
or bad, actually. Yeah, so, this is the way, mankind manages to understand nature. I mean, some of these things we'll be able to explain, in the future, in terms of the particles and frequencies, so the psychic phenomena taking place will be explained eventually, I think, even sooner than we think, possibly.
Well, I think my view is that there probably needs to be a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because
Just to give another example, actually, before earthquakes, a lot of animals actually
Yes.
are able to sense that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that comes to conclusion, it's all to do with the stress is built up and the seismic activity, they actually affect the
Yes.
electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah.
And animals are sensitive enough to
Yes.
tune into that.
Yes. Birds can actually see or feel magnetic gradients, so they would see
Yeah.
shifting kind of
And
things.
because of that, they're able to go to safety.
Mm.
Or before tsunami, for example.
Mm.
I think that happened in the Boxing Day one. I think
Yes.
the elephants
Yeah.
sensed it a few hours
Yes.
before, they're able to go to higher ground.
Well, I think that it was kind of in many ways good fun doing this meditation camp and all this kind of stuff that you released from people's minds and unconsciouses and stuff like that. But I think it was kind of phenomenally naive in some ways because it wasn't a really very controlled sample, and we weren't really all trying to meditate in precisely the same way. I mean, the way I've kind of discovered since brainwave entrainment, I'm a big fan of brainwave entrainment, and I really would recommend it to anybody who wants to learn how to meditate better, because it can help kind of get your brain waves into an even kind of space, so that you're rather than having your brain waves going off in all directions like most of us do most of the time, and it's kind of not giving anything away about the book to say really, it's about my own journey with these things. It's very much that you can't expect to improve the world
You can't
unless you've really improved yourself.
Exactly, yeah.
And I know this is a kind of almost like a trite thing to say, but there's still a lot of people in the world who are rushing around trying to save the world by doing things out there.
Another one I talk about saving the planet. And that's
Exactly.
It's a lot of rubbish, because
Well,
the planet could look after itself very well. We have to save ourselves.
well, indeed, yeah, right.
Don't you think the common problem here with all of this is that people are always trying to find ways to make their own lives the way they want them to be, to control them? So that what happens is all these different new religions, the New Age, it's all really tapping into that idea that if you think or do in the right way, and you do the right thing, you do the right meditation, you do the right kind of prayer, you eat the right food, that all of a sudden your life's going to be wonderful. And right now it's things like smartphones, or get a smartphone, you get everything.
Yeah.
It's all, so that's what they're playing on.
Yes.
The CIA and all these people, they're playing on this need that people have
Well, yes.
to be in control and to feel safe.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's what's behind it.
I think it's like what I was saying about we all have these kind of millenarian urges. That we're all kind of striving for a better world, and we don't quite know how to do it, and we think there might be some movement or something like this. And you look back to the raw, uneducated masses of the Middle Ages, and it's just like almost like mob mentality, and that's kind of where it goes to if you don't kind of put it under the light of reason, And I don't think there's anything wrong in trying to arrange your own life, the way that you want it. But it's when you start trying to arrange it on other people that I think it becomes a big problem. So long as you can do what is required without harming other people or putting some, you have to be like this, then that's where it goes, kind of wrong, I think.
The American state, obviously, in a lot of what you said in the guise of the CIA, has had a slightly bad press here. I'm quite interested at the moment in conspiracy theories.
Yes.
And I've got a number of friends, acquaintances, particularly in the church I go to, chatting to two people the other day who were convinced. One of them said, I know the American state has basically killed 3,000 people in the Twin Towers. Now, I'm conscious that the Americans are on record of doing a lot of strange things, but I am struggling with that. And then the whole thing descends into advanced material physics.
Yes.
Now, one thing, regardless of the fact, however bad the Americans might be at various stages, I don't believe they killed 3,000 people in cold blood. But that's, up for debate, I appreciate that. But I also said about the material science, because it works as a system, system effects are quite different to the individual component effects on these materials which people are getting rid of.
Yeah.
And, nobody's ever flown a big plane to a skyscraper before to see what's happened that I'm aware of. But just as a general phenomenon, obviously, just to think back, the whole mindset around conspiracy theories, because to me it's kind of perhaps linked to some of these phenomena, both in that way and also the fact that we're talking a lot about America and control. Obviously, if they were to have done that, it's obviously outrageous. By definition, so they had a pretext for going into the Middle East.
Sure.
Other than just oil.
Yes. Well, if I can kind of come in there before it kind of gets even bigger. I would say the thing is, I'll just start back with how this, because I was talking about, obviously, this guy, Gordon Wasson. The more I looked into this guy, he really seems to have a lot of strings, pulling a lot of pies. But the thing is that one thing I think you have to remember about intelligence organisations is compartmentalisation and need to know. So I'm not saying by any means, please don't, because I've been focusing on, this particular thread that the Masons, who kind of infiltrated the CIA and, probably Alan Dulles and people like that, had all this stuff going. I'm quite certain that 99.5% of the CIA probably know nothing about this. It's just one particular kind of little cell that, happen to all have this interest in weird stuff, and Aldous Huxley's probably, because Aldous Huxley moved over to America after the war, hasn't he, and he's in California, and then, people like Gordon Wasson there, imagine Wasson and Huxley getting together. They could probably, plan the future of the human race, but it might be a nightmare. Do you know what I mean? And so, but most of the people in the CIA, they're out there spying on the Russians and looking at Fidel Castro and all this sort of stuff.
Doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Doing what they're supposed to be doing, And it's like, well, there's just this bunch of people, and then occasionally it blossoms, and you get, the Men Who Stare at Goats, or the. I haven't seen it, I'm afraid. I didn't realise that the film was actually taken from a genuine book.
Well, I saw the Horizon documentary as a teenager, Targum Putov on remote viewing. So I linked it immediately back to that.
Yeah, well, exactly. The thing is, it kind of, one side of it's like deadly serious international espionage, and the other side, it's
bonkers,
balmy, and the difference between these two realities is kind of like the gap between the stones of the Great Pyramid, They're just there, and you can almost, which one is which?
I think one problem with intelligence services is that they are notorious for attracting fantasists, weirdos, would-be James Bonds, and that sort of thing, who sometimes, even if they aren't doing weird stuff, like to claim that they're doing weird stuff. So I think partly, there's a human resource issue is that that intelligence services attract the weirdos. Well, they can do.
Well, yes, but the thing is,
They'd like you to believe that.
Sorry?
They'd like you to believe that.
Well, yes, but the thing is, they also, I mean, for instance, you need kind of people with unusual forms of intelligence. You know, like the people who worked at Bletchley, for instance. I mean, I happen to have the unique kind of privilege of knowing several people who have parents who were at Bletchley Park, you know. And there is something kind of interesting about these people. They do seem to have a slightly different kind of take on the world. And I don't think this is entirely just the experience at Bletchley. I think that Bletchley attracted those kind of people, and I think those kind of people have children who are a bit like that, you know. And that, you know, some of it might be a bit wacky and over the edge, but some of it is kind of like cutting edge thing. We would never get new breakthroughs in science and things if we didn't have people who were like, you know, a bit wacky, you know. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's the nature of exploration, really, I guess. Oh God, so how are we doing? So we had enough weirdness for the night.
Can I just ask?
Yes.
You went to the camp and
yes.
you went to an experience, and
yes.
At any time did you feel like you wouldn't get out of it? Because, you know, like, I came thinking
yes.
it was going to be nice to think about
yes.
getting into a
yes.
feeling that you can influence the world
yes.
and thinking and that.
Mm.
But
do you mean in the first camp or over the experience of the 3 years?
Well,
first one. Well,
I haven't read your book,
well,
but
right.
Monkey Camp.
Yes, right. Well, obviously I went there. When I first went, it was just the first camp, summer 1995. I don't know if people remember, summer 1995 was just the most blisteringly wonderful summer that probably most of us can remember. I kind of found that I'd kind of got into deep water in a way, but at the same time it was kind of largely, it was in my head. It was just that I was, you know, it was just such a big experience and experiment and all this kind of stuff. But one of the things is that I never, actually there's a brief little vignette in the book where I'm sitting by the gate camp, by the campfire, and 2 people actually leave. And I was at this, pretty well, you know, I've kind of elaborated a few things in the book, but this is a real thing. Most of the things I describe are real things, and it's pretty close to how they happen. And this couple, this man and this woman, are kind of stomping across the field, and he's getting all kind of grumpy, and she's saying, "Oh, let's stay," and he's saying, "No, you can stay. It's all mad, you know." And she's going, "Oh, I don't want to be. Please don't leave me." And he says, "Well, you do what you like, you know." And then, this was like about 2 hours before I put some foot wrong somewhere and I stumbled into a group and I got really upset because somebody was upset with me, and then all the avalanche falls, you know. And obviously, I kind of looked back, you know, a few hours ago, there was me sitting blithely at the spy campfire, drinking a cup of tea, talking to my friend, you know, this is nice, you know. Oh, those people there. And then a few hours later, I'm like kind of, but I didn't have any option to leave. You see, they had a car. They presumably came together. They had a car. They had their own income. I was relying on somebody to take me back home at the end of the week. So I couldn't leave. It was a lock-in, you know. So I had to just sit it out and go through my process and have my meltdown. And in fact, I melted down twice because, you know, it's like this thing on the hero's journey, you know. You fall into the abyss and you come out and you think, oh, that's it. Then, of course, there's always a second one. It's like in Alien, you know. When Sigourney Weaver, yeah, she's got rid of the alien, she's up in orbit, it's all over, there's only 5 minutes left in the movie. Suddenly, you know, and it was kind of like that, you know. Just when I thought I'd got my head sorted out, my own unconscious foibles came out and grabbed me and everything, so I had to go through it all over again. But I was really, really glad that I did, because I think it's really important that you don't run away from things that your processes that you're involved in. And even though I had many, many disagreements with the organiser over many, many different things, I do very much agree with him about this. And you know, it may be that you might have to leave because you're ill or something. you know. But I think if you're in the middle of some kind of mental process, particularly if it's kind of, you know, like an inner journey that that I think that usually if you do stick to it and you know, just hang on in there and try to understand it, I think that usually you will kind of come out there and it will be worth it. And this is why I'm talking about this kind of this hero's journey, this kind of gauntlet that you pass through, and then hopefully in the end you're able to look back and say, oh, I overcame that obstacle, whatever it might be. And I think this is just a very big dynamic in life that is kind of my mission, I suppose, you know, just to, this is kind of what Waking the Monkey is about. This is what Waking the Monkey is finding that agency, finding that determination, finding that thing in you which can try and make sense of something and overcome, however difficult it might be. So, did that sort of...
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Well, I can kind of see we're probably running out of time, so unless we want one last very quick question, I can't see anybody. I can see Carol's looking like she wants to wind up at the end there.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I will...
We have a wonderful and interesting evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. And
if anybody would like to have a look at the book or purchase the book,
cut price, £3 off.
£5. There are plenty of copies.
There are plenty of copies here. I've got them in the box here. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank
and
you.
Hope you found it interesting. Thank you. The true results of this research, I dare say, are not likely to be published for a long time. So we cannot say whether it was successful in its aim, but it is well documented that it genuinely took place. So, we can be sure of that. Somebody was taking it seriously and putting money into it. And research, at least as far back as the 70s, has been carried out by the Maharishi International Foundation, obviously set up by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The research was done in the 1970s, showed that covert meditation groups had a statistical effect on random crime statistics in high crime areas. And I actually saw a newspaper article about this when I was visiting my family in Florida in 1982, which was quite remarkable. And I always remembered it. So when I came across this later, I thought, that's a real strange little synchronicity out of the past. But our own process was not the same as transcendental meditation, in that it involved rather a lot of wearing away of rough edges, as one might say, between ourselves. But it was hoped that the end result would achieve the aim when resolution had been achieved in our own little microverse, sending out waves, perhaps like the gravity wave ripples that have recently been detected. Suffice it to say that my own process at first camp in 1995 was far from smooth, and that's what the book is about. Can we have the next slide, please, Cal? I think we'll be on to. I'll be coming on to these shortly. To suspend judgment until the end, when hopefully there will be a bigger picture, an overview. But first, I suppose I should say a little bit about it before I build that larger view. The 100th Monkey camps of the mid to late 90s were, as their organiser, Palmer Jenkins, put it, an experiment in consciousness. The intention was to seek to work with what Rupert Sheldrake, we have Rupert Sheldrake, his morphic fields, morphogenic field resonance, which he popularised the idea well, he developed the idea, the scientific idea, which had been popularised by Lyle Watson in Supernature. Some of you may remember reading that. And this was based on the work of Ken Keyes, a researcher into animal behaviour, who had noticed a new adaptive behaviour in a troop of monkeys on an island off the coast of Japan. He had observed how first this behaviour spread throughout the colony and then unexpectedly had jumped to a troop in a nearby island. So some sort of psychic transmission was postulated, which was later formalised by Sheldrake in his morphogenetic field theory. Were arguing from his own evidence that there was a mechanism of resonance, as in when a guitar string will sound when a note of the same frequency is made. Sheldrake's work has been criticised, but his more recent Dogs That Know When Their Masters Are Coming Home work, which possibly some people may have come across, has demonstrated what many dog owners and animal lovers have known.
Tonight's Headingley Literature Festival event in partnership with Leeds Combined Arts. Sorry for the delay. I'm sure it is a fantastic evening in front of us. Our guest speaker today is Rae Randall. Claire published last year her book Waking the Monkey, Becoming the 100th Monkey. And today she is basically talking about new information which became apparent since basically she published this book. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you very much. Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Headingley LitFest. May I thank Richard Wilcox of the LitFest and Carol Downing, who has suffered some awful injury which very nearly prevented her from being here this evening. So I have to express particular gratitude to her for basically sticking with it through the last hour or so. It's been a bit of a nightmare, not the least several hours before for her. And Leeds Combined Arts, so thank you. The title of my talk is Beyond the 100th Monkey. And some of you here tonight will already know my book, Waking the Monkey, so I shan't be going on tremendously about that, but I will be adding a little bit of historical context and backstory, most of which I've only discovered since I published the book last year, even though some of it's been in the public domain for a while. Now, those of the audience here tonight who have read the book may be surprised to hear some of what I am here to talk about. However, I would ask you for a long time that these animals do indeed seem to know when their masters are coming home. And so there must be some mechanism or means whereby this is effected. It has been postulated that there is a consciousness field in which we all partake and through which these acts. I would argue for a more differentiated model, since clearly some conscious beings are more connected in this way than others. I shall return to this later on. So the idea of morphic resonance was behind the idea of the 100th Monkey project, if not exactly a test of it, nonetheless an attempt to put it into practice. So the basic process we engaged in was to meditate on current world issues. There was things like Bosnia at the time, in the mid-90s, discuss all the feelings, ideas and interactions between us on in our expression of these, and seek to come to some collective group understanding or sense of the situation which had been put under the microscope. It was hoped that mutual understanding between people who might find themselves representing diverse viewpoints could be reached, and that this would send out a morphic resonance of resolution into the world, which would be of assistance. If all this sounds a bit woo-woo, we can remind ourselves that in the couple of decades or so prior to the camps, the CIA had been engaging in remote viewing research in the hope that it might have intelligence applicability. Yes, but it left me with a feeling that I dealt with much limitation and negativity within myself, regardless of what the morphic resonance of the camp had on the world. So that my dealings with the world outside would be more functional and fruitful than before. And it gave me so much material to think about that I eventually wrote my book about the camp and what I consider to have been a rite of passage of sorts through which I was to pass. I've now begun working on the sequel, and I won't give too much away about that, but I will just say that my summary of it would be that in the end, the outcomes were influenced by human weakness, which I suppose is probably no big surprise. Strange synchronicities did occur along the way, which is always something that, you know, people say it's kind of an indication that something's going on in some kind of psychic realm. Because and what really, really freaky one we had was that on the morning of the 28th of August 1995, we were meditating on the Bosnian War and the siege of Sarajevo and all that stuff that people will probably remember. We later found out that while we'd been doing that, somebody had shelled a bread queue and dozens of people had been injured or killed. I can't remember what the feeling was, but it was eventually caused such an outcry that NATO got involved and the war was brought to an end. So that's kind of not exactly the way you would imagine that